What's up, gamers? We're gaming again today. This is Papa Jumpluff with Sam I Am behind the cam.
Hi.
Today he's going to show off Light Dragonite.
Yeah, so this deck is actually pretty interesting. It was last summer sometime. I'm not sure the exact date, but Muck was banned in WOTC 20. One of the biggest shakeups the format has seen since I started playing personally. So it was my goal from that ban to see the limits of what could be done with Pokemon that were previously on the cusp of being playable, but were never really allowed to see any sort of spotlight on the basis that they got shut down by Muck. So I threw a bunch of those into a pile, and it turned out that the pile was itself just super playable on its own. So I've only made a couple tweaks since I first built it, and it's been a pretty decent meta staple since then. Pretty squarely true to. We'll go over matchups in a bit. But to start things off, the typical playset of Clefas. I like them. We all like them. And I have a single Magby. I'm perpetually terrified of Aerodactyl in this meta, shutting down evolutions. And this is a stage 2 deck, so just having a single copy in here helps quite a bit. From there, we have the main line. I don't know if we already established, but this is a Dragonite deck. This is my personal favorite Dratini. I've seen other people play one of the Neo ones. I just like this for the rap potential. It doesn't really come into play too much, so it's not overly relevant. From there, we have a 2-2 split of Dark Dragonair and Light Dragonair. This is a Light Dragonite deck, which is very interesting to say the least. There's a 2-2 split here because Dark Dragonair just allows you to turn on everything else inside of your deck. Getting one of each of these out early is a pretty good way to make sure that you get a full board state in very short order. Light Dragonair has some interesting utility too. Normally stage 1s are just kind of eh. But in this case, it's surprisingly playable against Steelix decks, specifically, because its first attack for DCE removes 1 damage counter from each of your Pokemon, so unless your opponent does quirky things with Strength Charm turn after turn and gets lucky with coin flips, you can pretty consistently make sure that their Steelix isn't actually impacting your board. Because on average, you'll be removing 1 damage counter every turn, and on average, they'll be dealing 10 to everything every turn, and then every other turn flipping tails, so they won't be able, so on average, they're only attacking once every other turn. It's interesting math, but it's a nice to have attack that counters one of the best Pokemon in the meta. Very nice to have. The namesake of the deck, though, is Light Dragonite. I got 2 copies of them in here right now. I might up it to a 3rd sometime in the near future. It is very, very powerful against very specific cards and decks. You guys have seen Zapzor pop up a lot on the channel. I don't think anyone's done a deck tech, but it's basically the closest thing we have to like an S tier deck, a deck to beat, the sort of thing that you always have to be prepared to play against because it's so consistent and so powerful. This deck is one of the few true and genuine Zapzor counters, and it is all thanks to this little duder. I'll just break down the numbers from there then. It has 100 HP for a stage 2, which I think is pretty standard outside of some that are higher and a couple that are lower. It has a DCE retreat cost, which is solid, no weakness, which is very important, and a fighting resistance, which again, it's better than no resistance, so we take those. The ability of Light Dragonite is one of the most important things of the deck, let alone the card. It shuts down all secondary effects of all special energies, and more importantly, it makes, or not more importantly, but equally as importantly, it makes it so that those energies only provide colorless energy. So your opponent's metal energies no longer reduce damage, and they no longer contribute metal energy to the attack that they're trying to get off or whatever. Sizor can still sort of skirt by with triple colorless, but it makes their life significantly more difficult. Your opponent's rainbow energies also don't do anything. Their warp energies don't do anything. Their cyclone energies don't do anything. So many cards just get automatically shut down by Light Dragonite's ability, specifically when it's in the active slot. That is the only condition for the effect. And it also has an attack, which is extremely solid. 3 energy for 40 is standard for attacks in this format. Just triple 40 is a solid rate. You like to have it. And then it has a secondary effect, which is surprisingly applicable. It prevents all effects of attacks except for damage done to Light Dragonite during your opponent's next turn after he uses that attack. So any sort of paralysis or sleep effects just doesn't matter. Very solid mon. It's the staple card of the deck. You want this to be in the active slot as much as possible to stifle your opponent's energy effects as much as possible. And ideally, in a game, you're just going to be dealing 40 every turn, either 2-shotting or 3-shotting pretty much everything that your opponent puts down. To support the main line, we have a 2-2 split for Furt. Furt is another one of the most powerful mons to see an uptick in play after the Muck ban. You've definitely seen it on the channel in other decks before, including this one. DCE for 30 is a very solid rate, and 70 HP, very solid rate. And the ability itself is super important. You get to tutor up any of a bunch of different energies from your deck. Don't let Light Dragonite fool you. Just because he shuts down a lot of things for energies doesn't mean this deck runs fewer of those. So we'll go over those in a bit, but it's extremely important. And I also personally like Furt because it helps rescue certain cards in your hand when you're trying to use Professor Oak. Like if you have a Stadium and an important Stage 2 in your hand that you don't want to discard, you just shove those back in, and you don't have to discard those anymore. It's very nice to have. It also is a built-in anti-deck out. You could shuffle 2 cards in, fail to find, bada bing, bada boom. You don't lose from decking out anymore. Very nice. I also have 2 of this little duder. Ditto, extremely good card in the deck. It has a relatively low free retreat count, so it's nice to have this as like copies 6 through 7 of babies or whatever your opponent has in the active slot. But more importantly, Ditto is a very good counter to very specific meta Pokemon. I mentioned earlier that this deck counters Zapsor, and this is the second reason why this deck counters Zapsor very nicely after Light Dragonite, because against Caesar specifically, Ditto is very good because of its ability. It becomes a copy of the defending Pokemon when it's in the active slot, and you can treat energy attached to Ditto as though it were energy of any type. So if you have 2 double colorless energy, for example, on Ditto, you can make it a copy of Scizor, and then use heavy metal and count all 4 quote-unquote energy attached to Ditto as metal energy. So you can essentially use and abuse heavy metal better than the Scizor itself, and that is really good. There have been games where I just bring it to the active slot, attach an energy, and just one-shot the Scizor, and that's extremely good for a Pokemon that is usually notoriously one of the most difficult things to kill in the format. Up next, I'll just go over the trainer base. For the most part, it's pretty standard. We got 2 fan clubs, 2 oaks, dropping stuff. 2 oaks, 2 item finders, 2 gusts, 2 comp search, 2 energy removal. Might want to up that too. I'm honestly not sure. Copycat just to smooth out draws, some gold berries, some heal. I usually don't make a deck without some kind of way to heal my active mons. And then some more interesting things. The stadium that we play in here, I apologize for the foreign language, but this is, I believe, Rocket's training gym in English. The idea here is that this increases the retreat cost of all Pokemon in play by 1, which is very, very relevant for very specific strategies, and honestly just for most decks in general, because it means that after you KO a Pokemon, typically people would bring up a Babymon or a free retreater and then swap back once they have a better idea of what to do in that turn. This forces them to bring up to either bring up something on a gamble that they might have the cards that they need, or it forces them to use an energy on their babies to retreat. It makes their lives significantly more miserable, and the way that the retreat costs act in this deck, this doesn't really hamper our game plan too much. And I'll go over the math for that a little bit later, I think. In addition to these, we have 2 copies of Friend Ball. Those of you watching the earlier portion of the video might have noticed that this deck is almost exclusively normal types, barring the single copy of Magby. This means that in a format where pretty much every deck is playing 3 to 4 copies of Cleffa, and usually wants to have Cleffa out, this is just a tutor for any Pokemon in your deck, period, no questions asked at most stages of most games, and that is very powerful in here. Just being able to tutor up your single Dark Dragonair that you need to start tutoring up your other stage ones or to get the last basic mod you need for the engine out early on is extremely good. To round this out, we have one copy of Trash Exchange. Town Volunteers is the go-to recycle Pokemon and energy in your graveyard card in this meta, but because, as you'll see in a second, this deck doesn't really play any basic energies. In fact, it plays 0 basic energies. Town Volunteers only pulls half duty in this deck. Trash Exchange is a bit more of a gamble, but it is a way to recycle things like DCE or boost energy, which we'll go over in a bit, after your opponent has discarded them or after things have fainted. So I'm running this as a one-of right now, and after some testing, I might actually add in a Town Volunteers anyway, to be totally honest. Because the lines for Light Dragonite get a little skinny at the top. If one thing gets prized and one thing gets KO'd, the plan can sort of go a little awry. Nothing disastrous yet in testing, but yeah, I don't know. It's a work in progress. From there, we're going to go over the energies. Like I mentioned earlier, Light Dragonite has a habit of shutting down all energies while it's in the active slot, but this deck is almost exclusively composed of non-basic energies. Some of these for utility purposes in corner cases, and some of these specifically because Light Dragonite shuts them off. Specifically, one of the big consistency cards in this deck is Boost Energy. I think it's only maybe seen play on the channel once or twice before because it's a very high risk, high reward card. Gets discarded automatically, shuts down several aspects of your Pokemon. It has several restrictions attached to it, but with Light Dragonite, those restrictions are pretty much moot. So, Light Dragonite shuts off all abilities of your energy, of your special energies, but it doesn't shut down the energy that they contribute, the quantity of energy, meaning that Boost Energy suddenly doesn't discard itself at the end of the turn that it's played, meaning that if you bring a Light Dragonite to the active slot, you can slap a single Boost Energy on and immediately start attacking without energy attached prior. It is a beautiful thing. You just start dealing 40 every single turn, no questions asked, and it doesn't even prevent Light Dragonite from retreating because Light Dragonite shuts off that restriction. And this is also where that gym that I mentioned earlier has very nice math, because if you want to retreat Light Dragonite, you're going to be ditching this energy anyways. So the additional pip to Light Dragonite's retreat cost doesn't really contribute anything. It doesn't matter. But this is very important. It's the thing you're going to be tutoring up with Furret the most often. Shuffle 2 cards in, get a boost energy, bada bing, bada boom, bam. It's the way that this deck operates. It is one of the most smooth, most consistent engines I've personally seen in the meta. I say that, I had a really bad game earlier today, actually, but for the most part, if this has a decently passable hand, a lot of your games will just be like turn 1, Fan Club, turn 2, Friend Ball or whatever to get a Dark Dragonair, to get a Light Dragonair, next turn tutor up Furret or evolve Light Dragonair into Dragonite, attach a boost energy and just go to town. Like in an ideal game, you're pretty much going to start dealing 40 every turn and locking your opponent out on turn 3, and this deck does it way more consistently than most other stage 2 decks in the format. Barring, I think, maybe Rain Dance, this might be the most consistent stage 2 deck, period. Very interesting, very fast, very lightning quick. Partially because of this, partially because of all the other tools we discussed earlier. It's a very beautiful machine once it gets going. But from there, other energies are kind of pretty straightforward. We have a play set of double colorless energy, which is fine. We play a single miracle energy because it is effectively a 5th copy of DCE, but it only works on Light Dragonite, which is totally fine. Nice to have, very nice to play. And then we have 4 warp energies. Relevant because of it was more relevant back when people played more status condition decks in this format. Because once Light Dragonite itself gets turned off, or is put to sleep, paralyzed, etc., its ability gets turned off, which means that energies suddenly work again. It means that being able to tutor up a warp energy is very relevant. You just slap it on, you can bring it back to the bench, and then put it back in the active slot, have it count for whatever. That's important. And in addition to that, we also have 3 Cyclone Energy. Critically underrated card. I think some of the more aggressive decks here jam a copy or two, but being able to force your opponent's baby or free retreater pad of the active slot is surprisingly relevant in a bunch of cases. Again, this doesn't really work when Light Dragonite is in the active slot, but if you have something like a Ferret or a baby that you can attach to this to before retreating back to Light Dragonite, very important in some cases, very relevant. And in a deck that doesn't really care about basic energies, why not? Why not just shove in 3 extra copies of this? And the same logic kind of applies to like Recycle Energy, which we also have in here. It's a way to sort of curb the effects of the gym in here when you're not retreating with the Light Dragonite. If you have like a baby or whatever, you can just attach this. Retreat goes back to your hand immediately. Very nice to have. And then we have a single metal energy, because being able to use Ferret to grab a single metal energy and protect your collectors is always very nice. Alright, I think we went over most of what the deck's about. To reiterate, though, it's an extremely consistent deck, and also pretty fun. It has somewhat lopsided matchups. It beats any deck it eats up any deck that cares about special energies for breakfast. If you're trying to do metal or darkness shenanigans, if you're trying to use a warp energy engine to swap your things out, any baby order style deck like Fortress, super good against that. But then at the same time, if your deck doesn't care about Light Dragonite's ability, and if your deck can deal 60 damage a turn consistently, this deck just kind of falls over. Like, it's a very solid tier 2 deck, but it has very distinct strengths and weaknesses. It utterly annihilates 25% of the meta. It loses to 25% of the meta, and then there's a 50% in the middle where it's, who knows. If they know how to play around it, or if they learn how to play around it, then they're in a pretty good spot. But if they have like Rain Dance is a pretty big weakness for this deck. Wigglytuff is a pretty big weakness, and then this deck just annihilates metal decks, which are like the next best thing, or equally the best thing in this format. Very fun deck to play, though. I like to whip it out every once in a while once the Fortress players get to play Santana. But that's pretty much it. Very fun deck. I thoroughly enjoy it. Glad to be here.
Awesome. Thanks, Sam.